What you are witnessing in Venezuela right now is not merely a political event or even an economic collapse. It is the visible fracture point of a monetary system that has governed global energy trade for half a century. As we move into the second week of January 2026, with United States Special Forces having captured Nicolás Maduro in a dawn raid on Caracas, with Washington announcing it will control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely, and with the remaining apparatus of the Maduro government clinging to nominal power under an interim president, we are watching something far more significant than regime change. We are watching the violent maintenance of a system that history suggests cannot be maintained much longer. I am not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice. This is an educational analysis based on publicly available information and historical precedent. To understand what Venezuela means for the global monetary order, you must first understand what Venezuela was supposed to be. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, larger than any nation currently pumping crude from the ground. At its peak in the late 1990s, Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA produced approximately 3.5 million barrels per day, making the country one of the top energy exporters in the Western Hemisphere. The oil sector contributed roughly a quarter of GDP directly and financed through its revenues almost everything else. Oil exports accounted for 96% of Venezuela's foreign exchange earnings. This was not merely an oil-dependent economy. This was an economy that had structurally fused itself to petroleum in a way that left no redundancy, no backup system, no alternative source of economic activity should the oil stop flowing. And then the oil stopped flowing, not because the reserves depleted, not because of war, not even primarily because of sanctions, though those played a role. The oil stopped flowing because of what economists who study this phenomenon call fiscal dominance, which is the technical term for what happens when a government begins to cannibalize its own productive capacity to fund current political expenditures. Between 2013 and 2025, Venezuela experienced the single largest economic contraction in modern history for a country not at war. According to data compiled by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, the economy evaporated approximately 80% of its GDP over this period. To put this in perspective, the United States lost 29% of its GDP during the Great Depression. The Soviet Union's collapse brought economic contractions of similar magnitude across its former republics. Venezuela's fall surpasses both in proportional terms, and it happened during peacetime, under a single continuous government, driven almost entirely by policy choices that were predictable in their consequences at the time they were made. The arithmetic of this collapse deserves examination because it reveals patterns that apply far beyond Venezuela's borders. In 2002 and 2003, following an industry strike, the government of Hugo Chavez dismissed more than 18,000 technical workers from PDVSA, the state oil company. These were not bureaucrats or political appointees. These were reservoir engineers, geologists, field technicians, the accumulated human capital of decades of oil industry development. They were replaced with political loyalists who lacked the technical expertise to maintain one of the most complex heavy crude extraction operations in the world. Venezuelan oil is extraordinarily difficult to produce. It is heavy, it is sulfurous, it requires dilution with lighter products before it can even flow through pipelines. It requires constant reinvestment in steam injection systems, water flooding operations, and upgrader facilities to convert the heavy crude into something refineries can process. When you remove the people who understand these systems, the systems begin to fail, and they do not fail gracefully. Production declines steadily from the early 2000s onward, falling from 3 million barrels per day to 2.3 million by 2014, and then accelerating downward as the global oil price crash exposed the structural rot that high prices had been masking. By 2020, production had fallen below 700,000 barrels per day. By late 2025, even with limited licenses granted to Chevron and swap deals with India's Reliance Industries, production had only crawled back toward 900,000 barrels daily, an 80% decline in production capacity, not from sanctions, not from war, from the systematic destruction of institutional knowledge, from the substitution of political loyalty for technical competence, from the monetization of deficits that should have been financed through austerity or productivity gains. The pattern here is what systems analysts call a cascade failure. Each individual decision, taken in isolation, appears rational to the decision maker at the moment of choice. Fire the strikers to consolidate political control. Print money to cover fiscal gaps when oil prices fall. Implement price controls to suppress the inflation your money printing has caused. Expropriate private industry to demonstrate ideological commitment. Each step makes the next crisis worse and the next intervention more necessary until you reach a point where the entire system is consuming itself faster than it can generate the resources needed for its own maintenance. The Venezuelan collapse serves as a grimly instructive case study in what happens when governments fail to provide the three basic economic mandates that justify their existence: stable currency, physical security, and functional infrastructure. When a state fails to protect the value of money or the stability of the electrical grid, its economic legitimacy evaporates regardless of whatever ideological justifications it offers. But Venezuela's collapse is not the story I am here to tell. Venezuela's collapse is merely the most dramatic recent symptom of a much larger structural shift that has been building for decades. The real story is about what Venezuela represents in the architecture of global finance, and why the United States felt compelled to launch a military operation to capture a head of state who posed no direct military threat, who commanded no meaningful armed forces capable of projecting power beyond his own borders, and whose country's economy had already been largely neutralized through existing sanctions. The answer lies in three words that explain more about the structure of global power than almost any other: the petrodollar system. In 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally ended the convertibility of the dollar to gold, collapsing the Bretton Woods monetary order that had governed international finance since the end of World War II. For 2 decades prior to this moment, the dollar had functioned as the anchor of the global monetary system because it was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and because the United States possessed enough gold reserves to make that peg credible. But persistent current account deficits, the financing of Vietnam, and the cost of maintaining global military commitments had eroded confidence in the dollar's gold backing. France, under de Gaulle, had begun systematically converting its dollar holdings to gold, and other nations were following. The so-called Triffin dilemma had come home to roost. To provide sufficient dollar liquidity for global trade, the United States had to run persistent deficits that gradually undermined confidence in its ability to maintain gold convertibility. Nixon's solution was elegant in its brutality. He simply ended the convertibility and let the dollar float. For a brief moment, it appeared that this might mark the end of dollar hegemony. The currency fell sharply against gold and against other major currencies. But within 3 years, a new architecture emerged that would prove even more durable than the gold standard it replaced. In 1974, following the OPEC oil embargo that had quadrupled oil prices, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger brokered an agreement with Saudi Arabia that would reshape the global financial system for the next 50 years. The terms were straightforward, but their implications were profound. Saudi Arabia would denominate all of its oil sales in dollars and would reinvest its oil revenues in United States Treasury securities. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection, advanced weapons systems, and security guarantees that would protect the Saudi monarchy from both external threats and internal challenges. OPEC followed Saudi Arabia's lead. By the mid-1970s, virtually all international oil trade was conducted in dollars, regardless of whether the buyer or seller had any commercial relationship with the United States. This arrangement, which came to be known as the petrodollar system, created something unprecedented in monetary history: synthetic global demand for a currency backed by nothing but the creditworthiness of its issuing government. Every nation that needed to import oil, which meant every industrialized economy on Earth, first needed to acquire dollars. This requirement established a floor under dollar demand that allowed the United States to finance persistent current account deficits without experiencing the currency crises that would afflict any other nation running similar imbalances. The United States could print dollars, and the world had to absorb them because the world had to buy oil. The privileges this conferred were extraordinary. The United States could borrow at rates substantially below what fundamentals would otherwise justify. It could maintain military commitments around the globe that no other nation could afford. It could impose economic sanctions with devastating effectiveness because sanctions denominated in dollars cut targeted nations off not just from American markets, but from the global oil trade and from the dollar-denominated financial system that mediated the majority of international commerce. French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing memorably called this arrangement the exorbitant privilege, and it remains one of the most significant structural advantages any nation has ever possessed in the modern era. Venezuela's role in this system was supposed to be straightforward. As a founding member of OPEC and one of the largest oil exporters in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela was a pillar of the petrodollar architecture. Its oil flowed to American refineries particularly suited to processing heavy crude. Its revenues recycled through American banks. Its political alignment, despite periods of friction, ultimately supported the dollar-denominated oil trade that benefited both parties. When Venezuela began to fracture, when its oil production collapsed, when its government defaulted on its debts and retreated into a siege economy sustained by Chinese loans for oil and black market crude sales, this was not merely a tragedy for the Venezuelan people. It was a breach in the petrodollar wall. And Venezuela was not alone. Over the past decade, the pressures on the petrodollar system have been building from multiple directions simultaneously. Russia, following Western sanctions imposed after its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, has been largely forced out of the dollar system entirely. Approximately 90% of trade between Russia and China is now conducted in rubles and yuan. Iran, under perpetual American sanctions, has conducted oil sales in yuan and other non-dollar currencies for years. Even Saudi Arabia, the keystone of the entire petrodollar architecture, has begun to hedge its position. In December 2022, President Xi Jinping visited Riyadh to discuss oil sales denominated in yuan. In June 2024, Saudi Arabia joined mBridge, the central bank digital currency platform led by China and the Bank for International Settlements that enables cross-border trade settlement outside the dollar system. Saudi Arabia maintains that the dollar remains its primary trade currency, and this is true. But the very fact that alternatives are being explored by the nation that anchored the petrodollar agreement represents a structural shift that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The BRICS bloc, which now encompasses Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a growing roster of associated nations, has made de-dollarization a central pillar of its agenda. As of late 2025, BRICS nations account for more than 40% of global population and roughly 32% of global GDP, exceeding the combined GDP of the G7 nations. Reports from the organization's recent summits indicate that 68% of intra-BRICS trade now bypasses the dollar entirely. A pilot program for a BRICS unit, backed 40% by gold and 60% by member nation currencies, was launched in October 2025, with 100 units supported by the bloc's combined gold reserves exceeding 6,000 tons. The new development bank, established as a BRICS alternative to the World Bank and IMF, has disbursed approximately $30 billion in loans, a growing fraction denominated in local currencies rather than dollars. Most people miss this shift because they are looking for a single dramatic event, a formal announcement that the dollar is being abandoned, a coordinated replacement with some new global currency. But reserve currency transitions do not work that way. History teaches us that the decline of a global reserve currency is typically gradual, uneven, and characterized by the establishment of parallel systems rather than direct replacement. Consider the British pound sterling. In the 1920s, sterling remained the dominant reserve currency despite Britain having been surpassed by the United States as the world's largest economy decades earlier. In 1928, sterling still accounted for roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves, approximately double the share held in dollars. The transition did not occur through a single event, but through a series of crises, devaluations, and structural shifts that gradually eroded confidence. The Great Depression and Britain's departure from the gold standard in 1931 began the shift in earnest. World War II completed it. By 1945, Britain was massively indebted to the United States, its industrial base damaged, its empire beginning to fracture. Yet even then, the transition was not immediate. In the 1950s, 55% of global reserves were still held in sterling. Britain maintained this share artificially through what historians now recognize as a system of imperial coercion, threatening commercial sanctions and exchange controls against sterling area nations that attempted to diversify their reserves. The sterling area survived not because holding sterling made economic sense for its members, but because Britain used political and military leverage to prevent them from leaving. The parallels to the current situation are uncomfortable to contemplate. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from roughly 73% in 2000 to approximately 58% as of the second quarter of 2025, the lowest level since the beginning of the millennium. Central banks around the world purchased over 2,000 tons of gold in 2023 and 2024 combined, the fastest accumulation pace since World War I. China, Russia, Turkey, Poland, India, and numerous other nations are systematically reducing dollar holdings and accumulating physical gold as a reserve asset that carries no counterparty risk and cannot be sanctioned. The response of the United States to this slow-motion structural shift has followed a predictable pattern. Sanctions have been weaponized with increasing frequency, freezing dollar-denominated assets, excluding banks from the SWIFT network, blocking access to dollar clearing systems. These measures have proven effective in the short term against targeted nations, but carry a paradoxical long-term cost. Every time the dollar is weaponized, every time assets are frozen, every nation not aligned with American foreign policy is given an additional reason to seek alternatives. The very effectiveness of dollar sanctions accelerates the search for systems that can bypass them. President Trump, who now commands the military forces occupying Venezuela's oil infrastructure and holding its deposed president in a New York detention facility awaiting trial on narco-terrorism charges, has been explicit about his response to de-dollarization efforts. He has threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS nations that attempt to create alternatives to the dollar. His administration's seizure of Venezuelan oil assets and the announcement that Washington will control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely while directing revenues into United States Treasury accounts represents the most direct assertion of petrodollar maintenance through military force since the system's inception. The message is clear. Those who threaten dollar hegemony in global oil markets will face consequences. But here is what history teaches us about such interventions. They can delay a structural transition, but they cannot prevent one that is rooted in fundamental shifts in economic power. Britain attempted to maintain sterling's reserve status through imperial leverage for 3 decades after the underlying economic fundamentals had turned against it. The process was painful, drawn out, characterized by repeated crises, and ultimately unsuccessful. The pound devalued from $5 in the 1920s to barely $1 today. The sterling area dissolved. Britain became a middle-power debtor nation dependent on international borrowing to finance its current account deficits. The transition from one reserve currency to another is not a single event, but a process that unfolds over decades, characterized by the establishment of parallel systems, bilateral trade arrangements that bypass the incumbent currency, and the gradual accumulation of alternatives until a critical mass is reached. The British experience suggests that even after the fundamental economic shift has occurred, the incumbent currency can maintain elevated status for an extended period through inertia, network effects, and political leverage. But it also suggests that these delaying tactics ultimately fail. No currency has maintained reserve status after the economy that backs it has lost its position as the world's dominant producer. As of early 2026, the United States economy remains the largest in the world by conventional measures, though BRICS nations collectively have surpassed both the G7 and the United States in purchasing power parity terms. American military power remains unmatched. The dollar remains deeply embedded in global trade, in commodity pricing, in debt markets, in the reserve portfolios of central banks that have accumulated trillions in dollar-denominated assets over decades. The network effects are real and substantial. Replacing the dollar is genuinely difficult because so much of global commerce has been structured around it. But structural difficulty is not the same as structural impossibility, and the pressures continue to build. Venezuela, reduced to economic rubble after a decade of mismanagement, currency collapse, and mass immigration that has driven nearly 8 million people from a country of 30 million, now exists as both a warning and a test case. The warning is about what happens to economies that fuse themselves to commodity exports and then destroy the institutional capacity required to maintain those exports. The test case is about how far the United States will go to maintain control over oil resources that are increasingly trading outside dollar channels. For ordinary people, the implications of these shifts are profound but diffuse. A transition away from dollar hegemony would gradually erode the exorbitant privilege that has allowed Americans to consume more than they produce, to finance deficits at rates below what fundamentals would justify, and to export inflation to trading partners who must hold dollar reserves. It would likely mean higher interest rates to attract foreign capital that currently flows to dollar assets by default. It would mean a weaker currency, which implies higher prices for imported goods. It would mean that the costs of American military commitments, currently financed through a global tax on dollar-denominated trade, would have to be borne more directly by American taxpayers. These outcomes are not imminent. The process, if it follows historical precedent, will unfold over decades rather than years. There will be periods when the dollar strengthens and de-dollarization appears to stall. There will be crises that drive capital back into dollar assets as the deepest and most liquid safe haven. The path is not linear, but the direction, for those who study the structural forces at work, appears increasingly clear. Venezuela lies in ruins not because of any single policy failure, but because of the cumulative weight of structural choices that made collapse mathematically inevitable. An economy dependent on oil, managed by political loyalists instead of technical experts, financed through money printing rather than sustainable revenue, and exposed to commodity price volatility without any buffer or diversification, was always going to reach this endpoint. The only questions were timing and severity. The petrodollar system, similarly, is not failing because of any single challenge, but because of the cumulative weight of structural shifts that are gradually eroding its foundations. An architecture dependent on Saudi willingness to denominate oil exclusively in dollars, on the absence of alternatives to dollar-based trade settlement, on American military dominance that can punish defectors, and on the continued attraction of dollar assets for reserve accumulation, faces pressure on every one of these supporting pillars. Whether this transition completes over the next decade or the next 3 decades, whether it occurs gradually through the accumulation of bilateral alternatives or abruptly through some crisis we cannot yet foresee, whether the eventual successor architecture is yuan-centered or multipolar or based on some new form of gold-backed settlement system. These are questions no analyst can answer with certainty. But the direction of travel, for those willing to read the structural indicators rather than the daily headlines, appears increasingly determined. The Venezuelan intervention may temporarily secure American access to the largest oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere. It may demonstrate that the United States retains the capability and willingness to project force in defense of its monetary interests. But it cannot reverse the fundamental economic shifts that are driving the search for alternatives. It cannot make China smaller, or India poorer, or the BRICS bloc less determined to build systems that reduce their vulnerability to dollar weaponization. It cannot undo 50 years of American deficits that have distributed trillions in dollar liabilities to foreign holders who increasingly question whether those holdings serve their interests. What happens next is not a question of prediction, but of structural analysis. Systems built on imbalanced foundations eventually correct. Currencies backed by accumulating liabilities eventually depreciate. Hegemons that extract rents through monetary privilege eventually face challenges from rising powers that see no reason to subsidize their competitors' advantages. These are not prophecies. They are descriptions of how large-scale economic systems have behaved throughout recorded history. The British learned this lesson. The Americans, it appears, may be next in line to learn it. And Venezuela, poor ruined Venezuela, has served as the canary in the coal mine, warning through its own catastrophic example what awaits those who mistake monetary privilege for productive capacity and political loyalty for technical competence. The petrodollar system is not dead, but the systems that will eventually replace it are already being built, one bilateral agreement at a time, one alternative payment channel at a time, one gold purchase at a time. The transition, when viewed from sufficient historical distance, will appear inevitable. Only those living through it experience the uncertainty.